So, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our friends around the world who are joining us at different hours of the of the day and the night. It's a beautiful sunny day here on Bere Island. A little cold, but no, not a cloud in the sky. Oh no, there is one cloud in the sky. I thought we might just begin with this short saying of from the Desert Fathers, because there was a question yesterday from somebody somewhere about gossip and murmuring, and this is the teaching on the subject from one of the Desert Fathers. A brother asked a hermit, "Abba, if someone brings me gossip, should I ask him to stop speaking?" So exactly the topic we were discussing about yesterday. And the answer is, what a responsive audience you are. So a brother asked a hermit, "Abba, if someone brings me gossip, should I ask him to stop speaking?"
Yes.
No. Why? Because we also gossip. We would be asking someone else to do what we cannot do. Then, what is the best thing to do? The best thing is to remain silent. Silence is better for us and for others as well. So, that's the teaching. But there must have been a lot of gossip going on in the desert. And then another saying of the desert that leads us into what I'd like to speak about this morning. Some brothers asked Agathon, "Abba, which detail of our way of life is most important?" Abba Agathon answered, "I could be wrong, but in my opinion, prayer is the most important and requires all the energy you can give it." Think of what we were saying yesterday about enthusiasm and passion. When you attempt to pray, demons attempt to interrupt you. So the demons of our past, the demons of our desires, the demons of our despair, the demons of our fantasy. So the demons attempt to interrupt you. They understand that prayer is the only thing that gets in their way. The other aspects of our religious life have a little latitude for rest, but we need to pray to the end of our days. This is the greatest struggle. So it's an approach to prayer, as I was saying yesterday, very different from just the cognitive approach that we're going to get benefits from prayer, from meditation, and then, we've earned, or we've earned our investment of time or money or whatever it is. But this is an understanding that this is a lifelong journey. It's for life. It's an open-ended commitment. It brings us to understand the meaning of faith. Father John speaks about meditation as a way of faith and an experience of faith. And I've spoken with some of you before about seeing the difference between faith and belief. Faith is our capacity for commitment, for relationship, and therefore for transcendence. The transcendence of the ego is what happens when we remain faithful to a commitment or a person or a promise that we've made. So faith is this capacity, really, for the human being to become whole, integrated, through difficulties, who is never unfaithful. We're all unfaithful at times, or in our minds, or in our fantasies, or in reality. But faith is our capacity, through good and bad times, through our virtues and our vices, somehow to persevere into wholeness and through a process of healing. Belief is our belief system. It's that set of values or doctrines or ideas by which we make sense of the world and of our behavior. We need a belief. We all have a belief system of some kind, even if you think you believe in nothing. Well, that's your belief system. But a belief system that is healthy is one that can sustain us in times of crisis or doubt, when we have difficult decisions to make, that we need values that hold together and give us a sense of integrity even when we don't know what to do. So belief systems are valuable and important as well. How do they relate to each other? Our faith, our capacity for commitment and transcendence, that heals us. Jesus frequently says to the people he's healed, this isn't magic, you know. It's your faith that has healed you. Your relationship and your openness in that relationship, that's what's healed you. So what's the relationship between faith and belief? Well, that's our way of life. That's our spirituality. That's our culture. And that, indeed, is our community. The community is formed through this combination, really, this interweaving of faith and belief. And it's possible, and it's something necessary in the modern world, in our global village, to develop a community of faith among people of different beliefs. And we're moving away, I think, from a world in which it was possible to create monolithic communities in which everybody believed exactly the same thing, or pretended that they believed exactly the same thing. And we're moving into another world in which a diversity of belief, and even maybe quite different types of belief, can exist and stimulate each other, perhaps, maybe even be in conflict with each other, but be contained within a community that is created by faith, by commitment, and by a common experience of the healing process. So, what I'd like to do now as we move closer to the Triduum, the three holy days of Holy Week, is to begin to look at the story that has brought us together, the story of these days, and the story that we retell. Telling a story is something that binds and forms a community. Probably one of the earliest things that human beings did was gather around a fire, as we will gather around the fire on Easter Saturday night at the Easter Vigil, and tell the stories or the myths of their people, of their tribe. And here on Bere Island, some of the older inhabitants will remember the days when people used to walk from house to house in the evening, and before the days of television. And they would come round to each other's houses and sit by the fire and have a drink and tell the stories of the people on the island and update those stories, especially update the stories of those who had emigrated but who had sent news about their new life. So the stories of the community were constantly being replenished and refreshed. And there was some repetition, but each repetition was also a reinvigoration and a renewal of the life of the community. So the telling of a story takes us very much, I think, into the life of a community. It's also something that we like. We like stories. We watch soap operas, we watch films, movies, and soap operas and so on. We love stories. And we like to become addicted to stories, or we like to get involved in stories and to be nourished by them. As children, we like the same stories to be retold. The telling of the same story is perhaps a way of giving a child a sense of security and reassurance, but also, if it's a good story, there's something more for the child to learn, to understand, and explore at each telling of the story. So there are trivial stories. I don't think anybody watches the first episodes of EastEnders time after time. Or, soap operas tend to fade rather quickly in a culture, so there are stories that don't have much depth or significance but entertain us. But then there are other stories, we call them the meta-narratives, the great stories of humanity, the scriptures, for example, and the story that we are going to retell and relive at Easter, which never cease to give us new food for thought and reflection and for the journey. Unless you become like a little child, Jesus said, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Perhaps we need to rediscover the child's capacity for listening to a story. We need to listen, first of all, and in that listening, in other words, taking the attention off the immediate thoughts or feelings that we are going through ourselves, and to turn our attention towards the story itself. This is the first step towards meditation, in fact, taking the attention off ourselves. And if we can listen to these great stories, then our own lives become more easily understood. The stories, in fact, begin to read our lives. This is the nature of Scripture. We read the Word, but the Word, once we have engaged with it through the power of attention, listening, the Word then begins to speak to us and read us. That's the symbiosis of Scripture. And stories come in many shapes and forms. They can be simple stories, deep stories, funny, tragic, frightening, consoling. And in great stories, all of these elements may be present, like in a great novel. There's a great range of feeling, and the greater the range of feeling, the better. So I think in these coming days we take time, leisure, to develop our capacity for listening and to be in touch with the Word, the living Word, that is resonating at the heart of this story of Jesus in the last days of his life. Jesus tells us, be careful how you listen. Be careful how you listen. Cardinal Newman, great theologian of the previous century, said that in this listening to the Word, our faith is stimulated. And faith, for him, is a continuing discovery. We're always finding out something new. We're always mining new riches. And we don't read the stories in order to become certain, because certainty is never static. That would be fundamentalist. We can never say we understand it completely, or we have certain proof about the story being true. What Cardinal Newman speaks about is an enlargement of the understanding, one of his favorite words, sort of an enlarging of consciousness, an enlarging of the heart and mind. And it's this enlarging that allows us to become more real. And he makes an important distinction, I think we could take with us into these days, between a real experience and a notional experience, or an intellectual experience, we might say. And a real experience is one in which our deeper selves have been enlarged in a way that allows us to engage with reality more intimately, more personally, and to be changed by that interaction. And that doesn't happen just at the notional level, just by thinking about it or talking about it or arguing about it. There's a deeper level of experience. And this is, of course, how we normally talk about meditation, a way of experience rather than a way of thought. But we can also apply that to this ritual aspect of our faith community, of our tradition in these coming days. The way we listen and read the story, the way we share it with each other. This is also opening us to an experience, something deeper than just thinking about it. So, let's turn to one of the opening scenes of this story, which begins with it begins with the Last Supper. We'll talk about that tomorrow on Holy Thursday. But immediately after the Last Supper, Jesus went with his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, across the Kedron Valley. Well, I remember that phrase, the Kedron Valley, from hearing it many times from childhood, and I always imagined it was a big valley, but in fact the Kedron Valley is a little dip between the place where the Last Supper was held, and it's almost across the road almost. So one of the strange things about going to Israel, the Holy Land, was to realize how small everything is, how short the distance is between places, and how small everything is really. And yet, in the mythic imagination, these are vast memories and vast scenes. So they go across to this garden where we're told he used to go before. Used to go many times with his disciples when he was in Jerusalem. One of the things that struck me there was we spent some time praying there, and we meditated there in Gethsemane as well. And there are olive trees there which are 2,500 years old. So that means Jesus would have seen one of these, the same olive trees, or some of them that we were meditating under. So it brings it closer to home, that sort of physical continuity, and the historical Jesus and the historical reality of the story that we are involved in. And the other thing that struck me was I was reminded of the visit we had made a few days before to Galilee, to the hill of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus had given his central teaching. And we were there, I think, in the spring of the year. Anyway, we were there at a time when the hills were covered with beautiful little red flowers. I don't know if they were anemones, I don't know what they were, but anyway, little red flowers. And so, of course, it made one think, was this what Jesus was pointing to? And he said, do not worry, do not be anxious, be like, look at the lilies of the field, look at the flowers of the field. These would have been his visual aid, pointing to the flowers that people were sitting on and were all around them. And then in Gethsemane that day, the same flowers were growing there as were growing in Galilee. So you could imagine what he would have felt like, knowing what was going to happen, knowing the tension that was building up with the authorities. And he predicted his arrest. That's a very important aspect of the story, actually. In all the Gospels, that he knew what was going to happen. He could read it. So knowing what was going to happen, he was sitting there praying in the Garden of Gethsemane and looking perhaps at the same flowers that he had grown up with and remembered from that day when he gave the Sermon on the Mount. And it's details like that in our life that bridge the decades or the great events of our life. And small details like that can have the power to unify our life and make us realize that we are a continuous story, that the different moments, events of our life hang together in a narrative, that we are a story, in fact, unfolding. And it's little details like that which show us that and remind us. Okay, so here they are in the Garden of Gethsemane. Let's begin with the account that Mark, who is regarded as the first person to write down the story, or Mark is the oldest gospel. So they've sung the Passover hymn, and they go out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus warns them, or tells them, that they will all fall from your faith. So in other words, they're going to break faith with him. And when the shepherd is struck down, the sheep will be scattered. Nevertheless, he says, after I am raised again, I will go on before you into Galilee. And here Peter answers, everyone else may fall away, but I will not. And Jesus tells him, well, today, this very night, in fact, before the cock crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insists and repeats, even if I must die with you, I will never disown you. And they all said the same. So a profession of faith. Then they go to reach a place called Gethsemane. He said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. The story is very simple, it's very condensed. There's not a lot of extraneous detail. And therefore every detail in it is very significant. Sit here while I pray. And he took Peter and James and John with him. So presumably a larger group went across the valley to Gethsemane to pray, but he took a smaller group, Peter, James and John, were the ones he took with him onto the Mount of the Transfiguration or into the room where he healed the girl. So there are certain moments where he just needs this smaller group. He took them with him, and then horror and dismay came over him. And he said to them, he didn't just say to the sky, he said to them, "My heart is ready to break with grief. Stop here and stay awake." Then he went forward a little, threw himself on the ground, not sitting on the ground, threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, this hour might pass him by. "Abba, Father," he said, "all things are possible to you. Take this cup away from me. Yet, not what I will, but what you will." So, what do we see here? We see going away to a place to pray. We know that he did this regularly. It was part of his routine to pray, and he would often pray in lonely places at quiet times of the day or the night. The night especially, or the early hours of the morning, are regarded as very powerful and good times for prayer, because there's not so much noise and distraction. The psychic energy around you is less intense. So early morning or late at night are good times to pray, and as everyone has found that, and he clearly practiced it. So he tells the rest of the disciples to sit and to stay there, to sit there while he prays. He takes his close prayer companions with him, and then he turns to them and tells them what he's feeling. There's a human intimacy here. There's some things you don't say to the crowd or to a public audience. You just say to those that you feel you can trust and who know you and with whom you can be yourself. And what he's saying here is horror and dismay had come over him, and he tells them his heart is about ready to break with grief. So what is the grief he's feeling? What do you think is the grief?
Ingratitude. Ingratitude.
Okay, ingratitude. The end, yes. Just
separation.
And separation.
Suffering.
Suffering.
Betrayal of those closest.
What's that?
Betrayal of those closest.
The betrayal that he by those who were closest to him.
Fear.
Fear. They say our fear of death is our deepest fear. So, but maybe just the fact that it was the end, you know. He could see the end in sight. And, you know, if you're having a holiday and you know you've only got one more day left on the holiday, that's the end is looming. So that's what he seems, maybe all of these reasons, I mean, I'm sure all of these reasons came together, and he is overwhelmed. We're told that horror and dismay, not just the grief, but the horror of death, and the dismay or the were overwhelming.
It was not just any death, it was the horror of a particular way of coming to the end.
Well, yes, possibly. Okay. Yeah. So then he went forward. Then he says to them, "Stay here, stop here, and stay awake." So the only thing he asks them to do is stay awake. Why does he ask them to stay awake? Hmm?
He's lonely.
He's lonely, yes. Yes, he wants companionship, doesn't he? So what we see here is a very graphic illustration of the theme we've been looking at over the last few days, of solitude and community. He's on his own. He's in a unique space. No one can substitute for him. We're facing our own. He's facing his own imminent death, and he is in the deepest solitude. But he is also in community and can share this unique experience, which normally isolates us, doesn't it? These sort of intense experiences usually isolate us, but he's able to share this deep suffering of his solitude at that moment with his close companions. So we see solitude and community together here. Some is symbolized perhaps by the fact that he's with them, but he goes forward a little away from them. St. Luke says a stone's throw away, so a few meters away. But he's with them, and he needs to feel that they are with him. So he goes forward a little, throws himself on the ground. So he's not, this is real desperation. This isn't just, sitting to meditate as we normally do. This is a moment in which he is overwhelmed. And here he prays that if it were possible, this hour might pass him by. Abba, Father, he said. This is the word Abba, as many of you will know, of course, is the Aramaic word for father, but it's a diminutive form for father. It's a very intimate way of addressing your father, the way a child would address father, papa. And it suggests an expression of a deep experience of intimate union. So out of this experience of union that had been growing and developing within him from the beginning, throughout his life, he prays to this presence, with which he feels one, to save him from this hour. If all things are possible to you. So there's a sense that what he is going through and knows that he is going to go through is a destiny. In his predictions of his passion, and indeed in the way that he accepts it, we see an acceptance that this has to be, this is the way it is. But it doesn't mean to say he wants it. And in a perfectly human way, he looks for some way of avoiding it. And indeed, we should avoid suffering if we can, with integrity. There's no point in looking for suffering. It comes to us. What we can avoid, we should avoid. What we can make better, we should make better. But what you can't do anything about, you have to accept. And this is the struggle then. This is the acceptance that in fact he can't do anything about it. It's just inevitable. He resists that as any human being would, but then he overcomes the resistance and repeats one of the petitions of the Lord's Prayer, your will be done. So, and in that you can sense the struggle to avoid and then the acceptance of what cannot be changed. So this is the first stage in this struggle. It's more than one. So then he comes back to his disciples. He comes back and what?
Sleep.
Finds them all asleep. So what's he feeling now? More alone than ever. And he says to Peter, and interesting to see the symbolism of Peter in this Passion narrative. Peter is the rock on which he builds the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and it's a pretty shaky foundation, as we know from the history of the popes over the last 2,000 years. And that Peter is constantly getting it wrong. He doesn't understand what Jesus is saying. He's the one who takes out the sword in a few minutes. Peter denies him 3 times. And yet this weak, fallible, unfaithful human being is the one who represents the disciples. He's the representative of them. He's the spokesperson. He's the shop steward. And you couldn't imagine, well, imagine how pathetic the other ones must have been. If this is the best he could find. But there's some significance in that, which of course often the history of the papacy has not reflected. It is the very human vulnerability and weakness and sinfulness which is the basis of Christ's presence in his community. And, you know, periodically this gets renewed, and we're all hopeful that with this new Pope, Pope Francis, we're seeing an acceptance or a reaffirmation of this reality, of the fragility, the vulnerability, the poverty is the key word, of the community of faith that we belong to. And we all feel relieved at this. Even non-Catholics and non-Christians feel relieved at it. I just read a letter from a Jewish leader to the Pope saying how wonderfully encouraged he is by the symbolism of poverty that he's initiated. So anyway, so this is Peter. And Jesus finds them all asleep, but he speaks to Peter as their representative. Asleep, Simon? Were you not able to keep awake for 1 hour? Stay awake, all of you, and pray that you may be spared the test. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So, as he does many times, he uses this moment of vulnerability when the disciples have been caught asleep to teach. We are most teachable when our defenses are down, when we are simply open. And as a born teacher, he takes advantage of that opportunity, you might say. Once more, he went away and prayed. On his return, he found them asleep again, because their eyes were heavy, and they had a big meal before, and probably more than a tiny sip of communion wine. And they did not know how to answer him. They did not know how to answer him. The third time he came and said to them, still sleeping, still taking your ease. enough. This word enough in Greek is a bit mysterious. It's thought it might mean something like the bill is paid, or it's settled, the account is settled, something like that. Slightly mysterious, but okay, the time is up, you might say as well. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed to sinful men. Up, let us go forward. My betrayer is upon us. What's significant about that, apart from the fact he doesn't rebuke them anymore? He's not sort of rubbing salt in their wounds. They feel pretty bad about not being able to support him. So there's no point in going on about that. But what's significant about the next thing he says here? The Son of Man is betrayed to sinful men. Up, let us go forward. What does that suggest? Hmm?
To uphold the light, to no longer feel the tamas asleep, to no longer be in that.
Yeah, in sort of passive.
To take the spirit, I mean to take the surge now, don't waste it.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So it's very proactive, isn't it? Let us get up and we go forward now. So, it's not let's wait here until they come and get us, or let's not run away, but we will go and meet it. That's the energy of the spirit of awakening that Shantideva was talking about. It's not just about waiting and thinking, it's about actually making the journey. My betrayer is upon us. So, in the Gospel of Luke, there's a slightly different, well, the same story, actually, but a couple of different details. Each of this is one story, but it's told with 4 cameras. And the 4 cameras are at different angles, and they capture, we might say, different details. So this is Luke's account. He went out and made his way as usual to the Mount of Olives. So this is a regular place of prayer. We like to pray in the same places. We're advised in meditation to, if you can, meditate in the same place every day. Probably in your houses or rooms you've found a place where you can pray. Accompanied by the disciples. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may be spared the hour of testing." So a shorter version. He himself withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and began to pray, "Father, if it be your will, take this cup away from me, yet not my will, but thine be done." So the elements that are common to these different versions of the story, we might say, are the essential elements. And here this essential element is this struggle to overcome a perfectly natural resistance, but not to turn that resistance into a denial. So he resists. When he realizes that it's going to happen, he accepts. And that's your will be done. That's the acceptance of reality. And now there appeared to him an angel from heaven, bringing him strength. And in anguish of spirit he prayed the more urgently, and his sweat was like clots of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and came to the disciples, he found them asleep, worn out by grief. "Why are you sleeping?" he said. "Rise and pray that you may be spared the test." While he was still speaking, a crowd appeared with the man called Judas, one of the 12, at their head. He came up to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" So, let's just go back to this more condensed version of the Gethsemane scene. There now appeared to him an angel from heaven bringing him strength. Has anyone here never had an angel in their life? It would be, you never had an angel? Well, we're going to have to try and arrange one. What is an angel?
A human angel, yes. Human.
Ah, well, yes. Yes, I don't think a big flurry of wings and...
An uplifting or a protective influence could come from somebody else, but it could come from something not material.
Yeah, okay. Right. I mean, I certainly have had angels. I have met and people who have been angels at totally unexpected moments. If you think of Luke likes angels a lot. That's why he brings lots of angels in Luke. And although Luke is the most sophisticated of the gospel writers and writes the best Greek and the most educated, he was a physician. And yet he uses the angels more than any of the others, I think. At the Annunciation, for example, Angel Gabriel appears to Mary. There's a beautiful painting by Potomo in the church in Florence where Mary is walking up the stairs in her house and she's just got one foot on the next step and she's looking back with a sort of look of surprise like that, and the angel is there. So angels are unexpected. They just appear, and that's the word he uses here to describe the angel who... what form that actually took, you can... I don't know what Mel Gibson did, if that... but so it would depend upon, your own imagination, really, how you interpret that scene. But it's an important statement, because even at this moment of total grief and overwhelmed, so much so that his body is sweating like blood. He's like clots of blood. He wasn't sweating blood, like sweating so profusely in fear of what was going to happen. Even at this moment, you can be touched by another, and that touch can be human. It's just human. It doesn't prevent what is going to happen from happening. And in a way, it's not an escape from it, even for a second, but within that grief, within that being overwhelmed, there is a real contact. You are touched. In that solitude, you know that you are in community, in communion. Okay, and then we'll just look very briefly at the Gospel of Matthew, which tells, again, of course, the same story. After singing the Passover hymn, Matthew is writing for a more Jewish audience. They went out to the Mount of Olives. He again tells them that, warns them that they are going to betray him. Now, you might take that as a kind of a blame, or what else could you take it to be? He's telling them you are all going to run away. Yeah, be prepared for your infidelity. And I know this is going to happen. So, just be prepared for it, and maybe you won't be so surprised at yourselves. At no point does Jesus blame them, he tells them they should stay awake, but at no point does he sort of condemn them or punish them, even after the resurrection. There's never a condemnation. They're never made to feel guilty, but they are expected to see, that they are unfaithful. But he doesn't try to lay a guilt trip on them at all. And again, he takes Peter, James, and John. He goes and prays. He uses many of the same words that Mark uses. He finds them asleep. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And we're told that the third time, after he found them asleep again because their eyes were heavy, he left them and went away again, and he prayed the third time using the same words as before. Using the same words as before. So that's what we will do now. Pray using the same word as before.
Saves his life, will lose it. You hold on to your heart, from yourself cannot part. If you don't let it go, you lose it. Look at the flowers in the field, beauty revealed. They neither worry nor toil, and they say that it's true. In all his days of youth, even Solomon was never so spoiled. He who saves his life will lose it. He who saves his life will lose it. You hold on to your heart, from yourself you cannot part. If you don't let go, you'll lose it. And the birds in the trees don't know where they will feed. They neither gather nor sow. There is not one that falls where God could not recall. Isn't your life worth so much more? Worth so much more than those? He who saves his life will lose it. He who saves his life will lose it. We hold on to our hearts, cannot part. If we don't let go, you lose it. If you don't let go, you lose it. If we don't let go, we'll lose it.
Good. So, there's just one brief question we might look at before we leave. Came in over the internet. When you say meditation is work, do you mean that it is hard work to keep returning to your mantra after distraction? Or do you mean that, say for example, some conflict comes to your mind during meditation and that you use that time to do the inner work to deal with it, i.e., do you work it through in meditation or put it aside and pay attention to the mantra? It's work, sometimes it's hard work and sometimes it's easy work. The work, though, is a continuous work of attention. So if a problem comes to your mind and during the meditation and you feel, okay, now I should try to think about this problem and try to solve it, that would be to give up the work. So at that moment, just let the problem go to one side. It will be there afterwards, and return to the mantra. So the work is to say the mantra continuously and gently. You're not repressing the problem, you're not escaping it, but you're putting it to one side until you can deal with it at another time. If after the meditation has finished the problem isn't there in your mind anymore, then fine, then just carry on. If it is there, then you'll be in a better state of mind to deal with it, and your problem solving will probably be more effective. So during the meditation, just gently keep returning to the word.